So I think this is actually a good time to start. And, I could imagine more people will be joining in. But I wanted to welcome you all to our first Visual Print and Study Center session, hosted in conjunction with MoMA's free online courses, Modern Art and Ideas. If you're not enrolled in any one of MoMA's online courses, we'll hope to join us by enrolling after this session. My colleague is going to paste a link to the course in the chat. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Francis Estrada, and I'm the Assistant Educator for School and Teacher Programs at MoMA. And I'm joined by my colleague, Esther Adler.
Oh, sorry, Francis. Hi.
So if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us which department
You'll all have to forgive me. I'm a little new to this. I'm Esther Adler. I'm an associate curator in our Department of Drawings and Prints at MoMA. And I'm really excited to speak to you guys about some art. I think one of the hardest things about having the museum closed and just being away from the artworks in general is that you don't get to look as closely sometimes. But what I found about doing these digital presentations is that because we're able to blow the images up so large, we actually get to kind of talk through a lot of details and things like that with our audiences that can make it really rewarding in that way. So I'm excited to do some close looking with all of you.
Yeah, and we're excited to have you here. And just so everyone knows, the Print Study Center session, it's supposed to be an informal hour-long conversation to extend the discussions in the course. We'll look at work by 3 women today, works that were made in the 60s and 70s by Betye Saar, Amos and Barbara Jones-Hogu, sorry. Their prints reflect the personal experience as artists that struggle to achieve a balance between responsibilities at home and the studio. One topic that's always interesting and relevant to explore, but as we've seen by the comments in the course discussions, in the forums, it's even more relevant today as most of us around the world are spending more time at home during the pandemic. So thanks to all who've already started the conversation in the discussion forums. We'll be starting a presentation from Esther, and then afterwards we'll we'll field some questions that we've fielded from the discussion forums and also answer questions you may have submitted live. So throughout the session, please feel free to post your questions for us in the chat. And we're using Rev today to create closed captioning and subtitles during the session. We're new to using this software for subtitles, so please bear with us in case there are any technical difficulties. And to access the captions, just navigate to the bottom right hand of the Zoom window on your desktop and click on either Close Captions and then View Subtitles, or click the 3 dots for more and then View Subtitles. Several of our MoMA colleagues are present today. They're going to be behind the scenes, but they may also respond to questions or comments in the chat. And also feel free to chat with any other person who's attending and responding also. We're recording this session, and by staying in the session, you're giving us your consent to be recorded. We'll share the recording in the course in the next coming days. And with that, we're going to start our conversation, and I'm going to turn things over to Esther. And whenever you're ready, Esther, you can just say when the slides start.
Sure. I think we can actually start the slides now. What I love about calling this session a study center is that the study center is actually a physical space in the museum that's the very heart of what we do in the drawings and prints department. It's a place where we can pull out the artwork, actually have a look at it sometimes together with the artists, sometimes with other colleagues. And it's a space really for learning and where I spend some of kind of the most enjoyable times at the museum. So I'm excited to kind of extend that space digitally to all of you. So as Francis said, we're going to start, we're going to look at the work of 3 incredible artists. And who we're looking at right now is Betye Saar, an image of her from the 70s. Betye is actually going to be 94 next week in California, so still very much with us, and an incredible voice in modern and contemporary art. And she's actually the only artist in this presentation who I have the pleasure of knowing personally, mostly because we did this really lovely exhibition of her work at MoMA for the reopening in October, called The Legends of Black Girls Window. And so Betty's someone whose work I got to know really well through the organization of that exhibition. And through that exhibition, we actually acquired a large number of her prints. And Betye isn't necessarily someone who previously was thought of to be such a prolific printmaker, but what we really found is that her prints are kind of key to everything in her work. And that's really a commonality between the three artists we're going to look at here. All of them were incredible printmakers, very well educated, very well trained in the craft of prints, which is of course a really kind of historic, well-established way of making art, but all of them were really interested in kind of pushing the envelope and breaking the rules in terms of what you're supposed to do with printmaking. And that makes it really incredibly rewarding to look at the prints themselves and figure out how they were making them, but it also makes them really suited to thinking about how you balance an art practice with your life as a mother, your life as a person, your life in the world that you currently live in, because all of them were using prints and really pushing back against print boundaries that were often seen with prints as a way to engage with the world around them in the 60s and 70s in the United States. So it was a time not so different from our current time in terms of turmoil, in terms of recognizing injustice, both socially, politically, economically, across all kinds of different communities. All three of the artists we're looking at today are African-American women, which in many ways was kind of they were facing both sexism and racism in the art world, in the world generally. And so watching how they use this very kind of traditional art making technique as a way to push through lots of those boundaries has been really, it's exciting to look at. And I think it makes us look at all prints in a really different way. So with that, actually, why don't we just jump right into Betye's work? So here, an amazing image of Betye, like I said, from the 70s. And she, sorry, if we could go back just 1 second. She's posing with this work that's in MoMA's collection called Black Girl's Window. And actually, I included this image because we actually just found it. Betye is incredibly photogenic, and we have a lot of amazing archival images of her. And so every time I come across another one, I include it in whatever presentation I'm doing. But so Betye posing with that work. And here she is already kind of an established artist. She has gallery representation. You see that work is hanging. Someone is taking photographs of her. She, before this, was very, it took her a while to get there. I think she grew up in the 20s in LA. She eventually goes to school and gets a design degree, and she gets married, and she has 3 daughters, several of whom become artists as well. And so Betye is very focused on, raising her kids in her home in LA, and art making is something that's incredibly important to her, but that has to, take a secondary seat in terms of how you, the needs of your kids. And so if we can go to the next slide, what I think is ingenious about Betye's practice is that she finds a way to make her kids her subject matter, her inspiration, and she turns to a media that allows her to really find time between naps, between feedings, between diaper changes, to really explore her art. And so she decides at some point to go back to school to get a master's degree so that she can teach art in high school. And at that time, when she's going to classes, she walks by the print studio at that school, and she is mesmerized by what is going on in there. The smells, the sights, kind of all of those different things. And at that moment, she becomes a printmaker. She decides that is what she wants to do. The nice thing about prints in general are images that you make on some, what's called a matrice. Sometimes that's a metal plate, sometimes it's a wood block, sometimes it's a screen. But you're making your image on that surface, and then you're transferring that image to a sheet of paper most often, but really you can print on fabric, you can print on canvas, you can print on lots of different things. But because of that process, because you have to make the image and then transfer the image to another surface, you get a little more flexibility with timing. It's not like you're painting with oil on canvas and then it's going to dry. So Betye was working with etching, which involves carving your image into a surface that's on a metal plate, generally speaking. And so you can start that, and then your kid wakes up from a nap, you can put it aside, and you can come back to it later, and there's no real disruption there. You can go back and forth. Eventually, when you get further in the process, it's a little more time sensitive, but really printmaking was something she could take home with her. She could do in her home studio, and she could work on as she could. And so what's amazing is to think about that way of balancing your art practice, and also about making your kids the subject of that process while you're also balancing caring for them. I just found it to be an incredibly generative way about thinking about what it means to be an artist. Like, what's the importance of that work, kind of really capturing your life, your experience. And so this amazing picture of Betty's 3 kids, the oldest is the one in profile, looking to the side, that's Leslie. The one on the bottom right, kind of with half the face there, is Esther Saar, who's now an incredible artist and printmaker in her own right. And then, as they tend to be, the youngest kid, the baby, right there in front, kind of dominating the image. So really, I think an incredible way of showing how she balanced that kind of work, home life responsibility. If we can go to the next slide. So Betty begins her formal career really as a printmaker, but what she's best known for today is an assemblage practice. And assemblage essentially means you're making sculpture, you're making installation out of found materials, you know, stuff you find in the streets, stuff you find in your studio. For Betty, the very first found material that she makes her assemblages out of is her own artwork. So what we're seeing in Black Girl's Window in many cases is her prints cut up and then put into a window frame as a device to kind of control how we see them. So her prints themselves become the material that she uses for the assemblage. And for example, if you look in the upper register of the window frame here, you see those stars and moons, and then you can also see them behind the figure at the bottom with her hands up across the top. And so those are all prints that were made with the same kind of shape, same materials. And so you can see how there are certain themes, things she was interested in that kept coming up in the prints again and again, and how she fits those into the windows. The other really interesting thing about Betty's printmaking practice is that she used soft ground etching. And soft ground means that when you're making your etching plate, you have a soft ground on it. So if you do things like push your finger into it, or find a rubber stamp you like and push that into the surface, that image is transferred onto the plate. So all of these stars and moon shapes we're seeing in the prints that end up in Black Girl's Windows are actually like little jewelry making pieces of metal and other kind of bits and bobs that Betty collected and then put into her prints that way through the soft ground etching process. And so I always think of her, it's like a little bit of a cycle, like assemblage made the prints, and then the prints are used to make other assemblage. So just the way she kind of came to that cross-media way of working, and really that willingness to go back to her own work as more material, just the same way she used her kids as her subject matter. Like, she worked with what she had and she used it to kind of reach these incredible places very, very much beyond her kind of own life and her own experience in California. She's also, of course, you know, a Black woman in the United States working in the 60s and 70s. She's incredibly aware of racism, of injustice. You know, she's watching kind of civil rights protests on TV and being horrified, like many Americans, about the violence that's being inflicted on these communities. And she very kind of, she says very upfrontedly, you know, I'm at home with these 3 little girls and I can't really get out on the streets right now and protest. But what I can do is continue to make my art. And so Betty becomes really a critical voice in terms of channeling protest, rage, but also a sense of hope, a sense of empowerment into her work of art. And so this work in particular, Black Girl's Window, is very much a self-portrait for Betty, but for me also an image of a Black woman in kind of an incredible fullness, a sense of her entire life, her connection with the cosmos, a future, a past, a very full portrait of an African-American woman at a time when so many Black Americans are fighting for that kind of recognition as people, as full contributing members to kind of American culture and society. So yeah, Betty continues to be an incredible inspiration, someone who has really made work that engages with these critical issues for a long time and really continues to do so even now. I think being able to speak to her about the world as it is right now, and to be able to watch her continue to make important work in this world has been really important for me in terms of processing how art can be important and how we can all use it to understand the times we're living in. And so with that, maybe we'll go on to Emma Amos in the next slide. Another portrait, just so you can see who we're talking about, of an incredible woman artist. So Betty is definitely the oldest artist we'll be talking about in this group. She's also the only artist who is still with us. But Emma Amos actually passed away this year, very sadly, after a long battle with Alzheimer's, and Barbara Jones-Hogu died in 2017. But both of those women were actually a generation younger than Betty, about 10 years younger. And so that puts them at a very different stage of their life in the 60s and 70s when they're making the work that we're looking at right now. The other thing that I want to highlight is that we're looking at 3 Black women working in 3 major urban areas in the US. So Betty is working in LA, and Emma Amos is working in New York after a childhood in Ohio. And so here we see her actually in an exhibition in New York. And so like Betty, Emma Amos was incredibly well educated. She had several degrees in art, in printmaking, in design. She goes back and gets a master's in art education from NYU. And so when she comes to New York, she is still in her early 20s, and she begins to kind of try to break into the New York art world, which she finds really difficult, both as a woman and especially as a Black woman. There's just not, she doesn't have kind of the connection, she doesn't have access to what was needed for success in the New York art world at that moment. But what she does have is incredible connections with the African-American art community. And because of this, she becomes the only woman to be part of what's a now legendary artist group called the Spiral Group, which is founded, I think, in 1964. By 2 Black artists who were really well known, Romari Bearden and Hale Woodruff, like lions in American art history, and especially in African-American art history, like huge, huge figures. And then you have Amos, who is a 28-year-old artist straight out from art school, kind of invited to be part of this group. So it's incredible, but she's also very aware of the fact that she is both the only woman there, and also that she's much younger, and that they've invited her, this like woman in her 20s, as opposed to other women of color who were much better established artists in New York at that moment. So she, you know, it's one of those things where she has great access to the group and she's involved and she feels appreciated, but she's also aware potentially of the almost weirdness of her inclusion in that group. But nonetheless, it becomes a really formative experience for her, and something that really shows the way that she continues to question race and gender across the entirety of her career. And so maybe now we'll look at actually the work that's in MoMA's collection, or one of the works, I should say. If we can have the next slide. So this is a monumental print by Emma Amos called 3 Ladies. And I should say that in addition to being an incredibly well-trained printmaker, Emma Amos also was a weaver. She had a degree also in textile design. And actually in the 60s in New York, she's working for the designer Dorothy Leaves, who's also an incredibly recognized kind of textile designer. And many of the designs that Amos made for Leaves then end up being translated to carpets. So she's an incredible draftswoman and artist. She really knows what she's doing. And that also goes for prints. When I looked at this print with one of our conservators and we were trying to figure out how she did what, my good friend in conservation, Laura Neufeld, said, well, whatever she was doing, she was like really, she knew what she was doing. Like, this is really complex and she really knew how to do it. And so what we're looking at here is actually 5 separate sheets of paper. And so the first 2 are side by side on the bottom of the sheet. So you have the woman's legs on the right, and you have the other woman's legs on the left. And then the 3rd sheet of paper is a big swath across the middle, where you have one woman's kind of upper torso and head, and the other woman's midsection. So that's 3 pieces of paper. The 4th piece of paper is the upper right, the figure on the upper right, in the red background. And then the 5th sheet is the portrait of the woman on the left, which is kind of printed on foil. And there's an interesting story in terms of how this print came into MoMA's collection. I had actually seen a version of just the upper left-hand corner of the print up for sale somewhere, and I thought it was kind of incredible. I was really impressed with that kind of nude figure on the foil and the silk screen on top of it, and I kind of wanted to know more about it. And so I reached out to the artist gallery in her studio and was like, what can you tell me about this work? You know, I'd love to know more. Are there other copies available? And they said, just hold on a second, we'll get back to you. As it turns out, this is the final kind of full composition that Amos had always intended on. So that one corner of the print is in fact like part of this gorgeous kind of very complex overall composition. But Amos had made them all. There wasn't a market for them. And so over time, some of the pieces got sold separately. They got split up. But in looking back at how incredible this image was, the gallery and the artist were able to put together a few kind of last sets where you could see the full composition. And we were really fortunate to get a few of them that way. There's one now also in the Art Institute of Chicago collection. So it's just really an incredible masterwork, both in terms of the scale and in terms of the complexity of what's going on technically. And I'll just say a little bit about that. You can see there's like a lot of different tones in the figure. So you have some areas that are like really flat color, the blues, the reds, those are silkscreen. And so you have kind of like, if you think about a mesh window screen that you're blocking out in certain areas, and then you can squeegee color through it to get these really beautiful, vibrant tones of kind of this flatness of color. And so any area that you see that has that really smooth kind of band of color is silkscreen. What we also have, like what Betty was doing in the previous print, is etching. And so if you look, for example, at the skin of the woman on the right, there's all that kind of hatch marks of whiteness there. And similarly in the face of the woman on the left, that is etching. And so, and it's an even more complicated version of etching in that it's relief etching. Usually when you etch a plate, you cut a line into your plate, and then when you roll ink onto it, the ink sinks into that line. And so when you print it, the lines cut into your plate are what transfer the image to the paper. But this is actually called relief etching. So it's a different way of applying the ink to the plate. So instead of the lines being what holds the ink, the lines remain white. So essentially the brown tone that you're seeing in the woman's skin color is on top of the plate, and the white are kind of the lines that she carved in. So, you know, it's a little bit technical, but it also goes to show that like Amos was incredibly good at getting what she wanted out of what are very kind of ancient and very well-established printing techniques. So she wasn't going to do it just the way most people do it. She was going to go into it in a very specific way to get what she wanted. And so and then she's putting the silk screen over it. So you have this woman's body etched, and then those bikini parts are, the top and the bottom are in silk screen. Also really hard to do, this major kind of figure in etching that she's then adding these kind of clothes over in different areas. The textile, that kind of striped yellow and brown textile, in the back, maybe a reference to her own interest and engagement with fabric, with weaving, things like that. So it's really, I think, a very personal and very just kind of a real masterpiece in terms of printmaking. It's also a really interesting commentary on color, and color in terms of the way we see people and we see skin color. And I have this amazing quote from Amos that I'm just going to read here. Forgive me. It says, every time I think about color, it's a political statement. It would be a luxury, apologies. It would be a luxury to be white and to never think about it. We're always talking about color, but colors are also skin colors. And the term colored itself, it all means something else to me. You have to choose as a Black artist what to make your figures, butterscotch, brown, or really black. white artists never have to choose. And I find this just an incredibly powerful and really, I mean, she made that statement, I think, in the 80s. And these are questions that I find us all kind of coping with right now, but that sense that like we are all colors, and how does an artist translate that to what they're showing in a composition. So for example, you have Amos, who is a relatively light-skinned African-American. And here you have several figures with varying different skin tones. You have a relatively kind of dark brown woman on the right. The woman on the left, you know, her face is this very kind of peachy color. Perhaps she's supposed to be Caucasian, different tone in the middle, different tone on the legs. And if you think about it, none of them are really white in terms of the way we would think of the color white in a painting, except for the woman on the other left, who's on the upper left, who's silk screened in white ink on a reflective surface that you're also, as the viewer, gonna look into and see yourself in, whatever color you are. So Amos is really thinking very carefully about the language we use, the way we see color, depending on who's talking about it, who's painting it. Like, what does it mean if we don't know that Emma Amos is a Black artist? Do we see the color in this image differently? She was someone who was very, very determined that her work and the work of all artists of color, of women, be looked at in some ways in the same terms as the work we know so well by white men. That idea that we should be engaging with the issues brought up here in similar ways, not differently just because she was a woman of color, and yet she was uniquely placed because of her experience and her understanding of those issues to really bring them to our attention. And so this is a work that's the museum acquired relatively recently in 2019, but I think one that really shows that Amos was engaged in thinking and conversations that many of us, especially as white Americans, are just coming to now. And I was really, in rereading her quotes and how her process has developed over time, so incredibly moved by her ability to say exactly what we're all now just coming to like decades before. So I just think this print is a masterwork, and one that I'm really excited to have on view in the museum in the upcoming months. And so that's Betye Saar and Emma Amos. Next, we're going to go to Barbara Jones-Hogu, whose prints are certainly as incredible, but whose position in the kind of political social landscape in the US was a little bit different. And so if we can have the next slide, we actually have this amazing photo of Barbara Jones-Hogu in her studio with the artist Gerald Williams in 1970. And she is working actually on silk screens. So you can see, these are not the prints themselves, but these are the screens that she would then use to make the silk screens. And if you look at the middle one, you can just make out the word unite. And in a minute, we're gonna see the print that would have been made with that screen. So again, Jones-Hogu, incredibly well-educated, a really well-trained artist. So she had a degree from Howard, she went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and she actually ends up getting a design degree from the New Bauhaus, also known as the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. And so she begins really as a painter, but she's someone much like Saar and Amos, who is really drawn to printmaking. And again, it's because of the ability to play with the different techniques. I don't know how many of our audience members have made prints, but it's you know, kind of complex. It's a little bit like magic. Like you do this thing to a plate or a screen and then voila, you get this kind of amazing image. And so I think these artists were just, you know, many in a long line of artists who are kind of impressed and kind of interested in getting their hands into that. And so Jones-Hogu is definitely one of them. And if we can go to the next slide, she begins by being really interested in woodcut. And woodcut is, again, a kind of older technique where you're carving your image into a block of wood. And so you carve the negative space. So what you're seeing as white here in this image is what she would have carved out. And then the black image that are the parts that held the ink and that would have been printed on the paper. So you're kind of carving backward. You know, you're making your image backwards, which is hard. You know, you're like not drawing your figure, you're like drawing around your figure so that then the figure pops out and holds the ink that way. And so again, Hogu is really, really good technically. And what's amazing here is you think, you know, she's making this drawing by literally gouging into wood. And she manages to do that in like a lot of different ways. Like if I was trying to do this, I'm sure I would just get like the same hammer chisel mark over and over again. But if you look at, like, for example, the lower portion of Hogu's print, there's an incredible delicacy there in terms of how she's drawing singular lines, the different types of marks she's making, how she's getting these big swaths of white in the American flag behind the figure. So she's, again, really good at this kind of ancient, very physical way of making prints. She's also, pretty obviously from this image, pretty politically engaged pretty early on. I mean, this work is called Mother of Man from 1968, and it is a skeleton, and it's a skeleton of a woman. You have kind of this floating orb and kind of the, you know, where a woman might carry a child. And then in the background, you have this kind of distorted American flag. And if you look at the stars in the upper right portion of the flag, there's almost like little eyes cut into them in a way that really is reminiscent of like the hoods of Ku Klux Klan figures. So she's really kind of playing with these symbols, that idea of the mother, maybe like the Virgin Mary from Christian imagery, you have that halo, but here it's the kind of natural hair of an African-American woman from that time. And it's of course a skeleton, which is something that's really jarring when you look to an image of a mother. So this is already an image that's speaking to injustice to the mother of man, and really positioning the mother of man in some ways as an African-American woman, which would have been a really strong statement at that moment in the 60s. But again, you know, she's also just super interested in what it's this balance of her own personal interest as an artist in these incredible techniques and her ability to make these really relevant contemporary statements that I think makes her work so incredible. And this idea of life, kind of how you balance real life with your artwork. So Jones-Hogu stops making woodcuts because someone steals all of her woodcut tools. And they're expensive, and she's put them together over many years, and she's a little bit like, well, what am I going to do now? She turns to screen printing, and it also happens that she's more interested in utilizing color at that time, which is also something she can do through screen printing. So if we can go to the next slide. And this is the last image I'll show you. This is an incredible screen print called Unite that Jones-Hogu does in 1969. And actually, if you remember the image we saw of the artist, and she had that screen in the center there, that was the screen that was used to make this work. And the message in this work is super clear, right? You have a number of African-American men and women raised fist in front of this bands of various of text that reads Unite, and that idea of bringing a community together, both to fight for empowerment and really to change current contemporary political social activity via this community, was something that was really important to Jones-Hogu. And in addition to kind of this incredible individual art practice, Jones-Hogu was also a member of the Afro-Cobra group, which is founded in Chicago in 1968. And this is a group of Black artists who come together to kind of commit themselves to making art that is both for a Black community and about that Black community. You can think of it somewhat similarly in the way that Saar is making work about her kids, also in the time between her kids. Like, these are artists who are very much pulling from the communities they live in to support those communities. And they're all very well, again, really incredibly educated, well-trained artists who are working as painters, as fashion designers, as you know, textile and designers and sculptors. But ultimately, they decide the way for them to most effectively share their message is through prints, because you can, of course, make more than one print. Once you have the plate or the screen, you can do kind of as many copies as you want in some ways. And lucky for them, one of their founding members, Barbara Jones-Hogu, happens to be a printmaker, and a really, really good one. So for me, Barbara Jones-Hogu as a founder of Afro-Cobra is in many ways the reason why this group was able to get their message out so broadly and to channel all their different ways of working into a message that could then be shared broadly through prints. So she was just incredibly important both to that group, but as well, you know, like as an artist on her own. And what's interesting, I don't know if you guys can see it in this image, but right underneath she's written artist proof. And so she's written the title, she's written her name, and then she's written artist proof. And an artist proof is typically something that you write on an image, like an artist, when you make a print, sometimes you try it out first before you commit to the final image. You run one, you see what it looks like, see if you want to change something. But Barbara Jones-Hogu, because she made so many changes between her image, because she was always refining and trying different things. In some ways, every single print she made was an artist proof. So I think it's especially meaningful to think about these images both as works where she could make multiple copies that would allow, you know, us to have one of these in our collection, and also the Tate to have one in their collection, but of course also to be available to the community that she was addressing at that time. But each one's a little different because as an artist, she just couldn't, you know, she couldn't help herself. She was always changing and experimenting and doing different things. So the way that these three incredible artists were able to link the very kind of technical nature of printmaking and their own joy and pleasure in experimenting with it, and how they were able to link that with ways to address the very real experiences they were having to deal with as women, as mothers, as women of color, as people living during times of incredible political, social turmoil, I find really inspiring and really something that for me sets a path for all of us, and how we can continue to use art, look at art, and make art as a way to dealing with contemporary times, and you know, as this print says, to uniting all of us in that way. And so with that, I've been talking for a while, so maybe I'll stop and we'll open it up to any questions that have come in from our audience.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. I mean, that's some really wonderful information about the artists and their processes, especially like why they chose printmaking, but also you touched on the ideas of how they respond to issues of gender and race during their time. One thing I wanted to ask actually was about Betye Saar. Could you talk a little bit more about her relationship to materials that she chooses? Her work, Black Girl's Window, is actually included in the Modern Art and Ideas course for transforming everyday objects. So I figured that would be a good start to the questions.
Absolutely. So Betye is someone who I think fervently believes that objects carry spirituality with them. That, for example, like a glove that was worn by a family member or someone in history then carries in some ways the spirit of that person with it. And in that way transfers that kind of sense of spirituality, that history, that experience into the sculptures she then makes with that glove. So when you look at Black Girl's Window, she has incorporated a lot of really meaningful materials that represent different aspects of that spirituality. So for example, she's, you know, a lot of the material in Black Girl's Window, as I said, is her own artwork. And so you have the stars and the moons at top that she talks about as representing kind of a celestial sphere, and that's, you know, those are images that she herself has made that she's using to do that. You have the image at bottom, which she's painted on kind of the black of the window of the Black girl with her fingers kind of pressed against the window. There's a lot of kind of scholarly and curatorial discussion about whether we're looking in at her, is she looking out at us? I had a Genia's colleague once say that she had always thought it was a woman with her hands up against the night sky. So that sense that you were looking through her into the cosmos beyond. Jana Brown, an incredible colleague, made that observation when we were in the galleries once. And so all of these kind of different materials, these different symbols of spirituality, of the cosmos, and really of Betty's own personal life are embedded in this assemblage. And then right at the center of the work is this little black plastic skeleton. And Betty will tell you that in the work, as in life, that death is at the center of everything. And that comes from both personal trauma, the fact that she lost her father at a very young age, at 4 years old, but also the idea of death as not being finite, as being kind of like a horizon line that we then pass through as part of life. And so, you know, again, the way she's transformed what I think is like a Halloween store figurine into this incredible meditation on the role of death in the life cycle and how we kind of continue to connect with people, both in this world and in the past and future worlds, I think is incredible.
Thank you for that. The next question is I want to kind of bring it into all the different artists. Angel or Angel asked a question. you talked that some of the artists were working from their home. They were trying to balance everyday life as they're doing at the same time, they were trying to respond to what's happening around them. So his question was, were the artists recognized during their lifetime while they were working?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that all of them were recognized, but what that means in terms of current, like the scale by which they were recognized is different. Like, for example, Barbara Jones-Hogu, as a member of Afrocobra, like her images were available and were out there and were very well known in the African American artistic community on the south side of Chicago that she operated it. Not so much in the rest of the art world in Chicago, which was mainly focused on white artists, and in many cases wasn't even aware that there was a group of Black artists working on the south side. So, she was incredibly recognized amongst her peers, amongst a community of people who were engaged with those issues with her and making that work, but not necessarily by the larger art community. And it was not so dissimilar with Betye Saar, for example. She's making prints, she's getting shows right away. I think she gets her first exhibition in the late 50s, and she's really being celebrated as a Black voice at this moment in modern and contemporary art. But as a Black voice, that voice doesn't necessarily translate into the art world writ large. And that art world continues to be kind of then written into art history as the narrative. And I think what we all know now, of course, is that there's no one narrative, and that it's very much what we're trying to do now, our responsibility as curators and scholars, is to go back and really kind of fill in all of those stories, because Betty's work, Emma Amos's work, Barbara Jones-Hogu's work are certainly as critical to how we understand art and history now, and finding ways to include them in broad discussions about art and culture are really important.
Okay, and I think Gerardo actually had a question that actually it's a good transition to the next one. He asked, do you at MoMA foresee an increase of the visibility of African-American artists in the near future and in more exhibitions?
I mean, I hope so. That's something I'm incredibly committed to, and I think many of my colleagues are. What's interesting is it's not enough to just include African-American artists. You have to really have the scholarship and those artists deserve our full attention and all of our resources, and really beautifully made, thoughtful shows. And that takes a lot of time. So I feel like the list in my head of, even today in prepping for this talk and looking at Emma Amos, I was just like, God, these are so incredible. Like, what project could one do? And actually Amos is someone who will have a retrospective that will begin, I think, at the Georgia Museum of Art and then come to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in the next few years. So I'm incredibly excited to be able to see kind of a fuller picture of her career as it developed. But yeah, it's something we're all very much thinking of. And I will say, from a perfectly kind of egotistical point, there is so much work to do that for any kind of young art historians or curators on the call, there are dissertation topics, thesis topics abounding. And it's not like you're gonna have to be like, well, what can I say about Picasso now? Everything's been said. These are artists who really, there's so much writing and thinking and exhibition planning to be done. So it's incredibly rewarding, and the work is amazing. So it's really an incredible pleasure. So that was a very long answer to yes.
No, definitely. I definitely agree that, visibility is not just the only thing that you can do, but there are many steps to take, and it's not just visibility, but it's also responsible visibility. And just like you said, responsible research. Speaking of artists and grouping together, could you tell us about how you decided to choose these three artists? I know you talked about in the beginning how you really admire their work, but what was your decision in choosing these three for today?
Yeah, sure. I would say part of that is that I'm already quite familiar with all three of these artists, having recently brought all of the work we looked at today, or having worked with a number of colleagues and amazing donors and just incredible people at MoMA to bring those works into the collection. So in some ways, I was already thinking a little bit about their practices. But I would say, just frankly, as being a working mom who has been stuck at home for the past several months with my own two little kids, I have become increasingly aware of how really hard it is to do meaningful, thoughtful work while also like getting someone a snack every 10 minutes. And that also really has highlighted for me what it meant for these women to be able to make these images that like 40 years later, I'm like, you know, plotzing over. How difficult it was for them to make those while also having to make a living and having to put food on the table and like vacuum occasionally and like all of this stuff. So it's something that's been meaningful to me personally, because I think it's a map forward for all of us as we are increasingly called to like manage so many different realms of life.
Yeah, and that's something we talk about in education too. When we teach, we don't just choose objects. We don't just choose to work with artists for the sake of it. There has to be that connection, and your connection with these women and these artists really show. So thanks for that. Jeffrey had a question, and you mentioned that Betye Saar was much older than the other two artists, but did they ever intersect or ever work together? Or was there ever any collaboration?
That's a really good question. I don't know that, I mean, much older might be like a little bit of an overstatement on my part. There's probably a 10, 12-year gap between the women. And mostly for me, that's a little bit about the fact that like Betye had toddlers when she's beginning her formal practice. Whereas for example, Emma Amos has her kids just after she's starting to engage in a certain practice. And Barbara Jones-Hogu also has her son after the kind of heyday of this printmaking process, which also shifts her practice a little bit in terms of what she can do, because art materials have fumes and her son is sensitive to those fumes, so that's something that affects her practice going forward. So I'm sorry, Francis, I have totally lost the question in my rambling. What was
It's did they ever have a chance to collaborate or work together?
So, I would not be, so I can't say 100% for sure. I would say that both Emma Amos and Betye Saar were recognized names during their life, and into the 80s and 90s, which was maybe a first or second wave of multicultural interest in terms of museums and exhibitions. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if they knew each other based on being like included in the same exhibitions. Both being kind of Black women working in an extraordinarily white male field, I wouldn't be surprised if they had known each other. Barbara Jones-Hogu was a little separate as she was in working in Chicago, and so I would be more surprised, I guess, if she had known either of the women. But she was also very active with the Southside Community Arts Center in Chicago, which has always been a hub for Black artists across the U.S. and internationally. They all, I think, knew Robert Blackburn, who is an incredible printmaker in the US, who was really engaged with really all African-American artists and artists of all nationalities everywhere. Like everyone came to New York to print with Bob Blackburn. So in many ways, he may have connected these artists. So it's a good question. I'll definitely have to look into further.
Yeah, and another question, it's interesting, and I'm not sure, but Sarah had a question of, did the world of predominantly white artists and galleries and the African-American art galleries and art world, did they intersect anywhere in a certain city, a certain time, or was there really no intersection during that?
I mean, you always have some intersection. And actually, my colleagues of color often remind me when we're working together doing the scholarship, this whole myth of like a Black artist doing it just for a Black audience is like a little bit of a myth, that actually there were friendships and mixed marriages and relationships that stretched across race all the time. So in some ways, separating them like this, starkly like that, is false. That being said, the formal kind of gallery representation, the exhibition opportunities, things like that tended to be very segregated, and frankly, very much reflections of the cities in which those artists and galleries were coming from. I mean, I've been very, one of my recent projects was the Charles Wright retrospective, and I've just generally been doing a lot of looking at Chicago artists right now. Chicago is an incredibly segregated city, and you really see that, and the art world's no different. You have an incredible, very talented group of white artists, simultaneously an incredibly talented, vibrant group of Black artists, and they don't know each other. They're even in some ways in the same schools, studying with the same teachers, studying with the same techniques. So there just was not crossover in that way, for the most part.
And I just want to say, because you mentioned the Charles White exhibition, that it was such a joy to teach from that when we were at the museum, because we were able to connect other artists in the collection like Kerry James Marshall and David Hammonds, and talk about the connection about those artists in the collection, so that you can have a full lesson about how they related.
Absolutely. And I should say that's something that really guides how we think about communities of artists, and also about communities of artists of color. Like, we, in fact, just recently acquired a beautiful drawing by an artist named Judith Hernandez, who was also a student of Charles White's, but who was Chicana, and who really took from his experiences as a Black man in America incredible inspiration, but in a very different lens as a Mexican American working in Los Angeles. So these relationships between artists are indicative of relationships between communities in many ways. And that is what I personally am most interested in teasing out. Like, how can we make, and there are white artists and international artists and all kinds of different artists working in these communities, in these cities, which is a reflection of how we all live. And I think that is what makes for the most kind of rewarding gallery experience, when you can look around and see voices that represent the actual people in the room, instead of some weird, narrow lens of just a few people in the room.
Yeah, thank you. And then Kath also had a question, but this is more about not just race itself, but gender equality. Her question was, these artists were active at a time when not only were Black people fighting for civil rights, but women generally were fighting for gender equality. Do you think these artists were doubly impacted by these issues and is reflected in their art? Or did the issues facing Black people specifically simply override problems faced by women at the time?
No, I would say they are definitely dealing with both things. And to be frank, like, Black women cannot win. When they're in the feminist art circles, no one wants to recognize that situations are different for Black women as opposed to white women, that they're dealing not only with sexism and misogyny, but a whole other level of race-based prejudices and violence. And then when they're in the circle of African Americans, no one wants to face the fact that women are very much on a second tier to the men who are seen as the leaders of that moment. So no, they are doubly impacted on both sides. It's incredibly unfair. It's something we're all still very much working to kind of address, and in some ways change. But to me, it just speaks to how incredible these artists were, and how amazing it is that they were able to make this work that speaks so strongly several decades later, even knowing that this was the conversation going on around all of them. That it was hard to, that the intersectionality that they're seeing, even before that word was like, a term that people could use and to express what was going on, they're finding a way to deal with it and to do what they need to do now. So.
Thank you. So on that note, there's a question by Hemangini. This is for you. It's like, do you feel overwhelmed with art created by upcoming artists as it seems to be constantly growing? How are the considerations when including an artwork as part of a museum? Or basically, what are the challenges when choosing which artists to represent, which artists to choose, especially when there's so much to choose from and growing?
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel overwhelmed by a lot of things lately. And so what I think is important to say, and for museum professionals to say, is that to pretend like there is some guidebook or some secret set of rules or some like cabal somewhere that's meeting to make these decisions about who gets shows and what's acquired and things like that. That's just not the case. Like, I'm a single person. I have opinions about what I think is important, what I love, artworks and artists I connect with. And that's very much what guides my personal approach to curating, to art that I think we should have in the collection, what I want to show. And I want to broaden MoMA's collection and ability to do exhibitions, ability to show our collection, and really ability to talk about the history of art in very specific ways. So that is what guides me. But it's me, Esther Adler, not art history, and MoMA. And so I try to look at as much as I can, and I try not to feel guilty about the fact that I'm sure there are a million incredible artists who I will never see and whose work I will never know, and who surely should be included, in the same prominent way. We just all have to we can't kind of let that stop us from doing what we think is important.
Yeah, and that's a great insight of you just talking about that. It is your voice that you're presenting out there, but using these artists. Question I had was you mentioned earlier that you got a chance to work with Betye Saar for Black Rose Window, the exhibition. Could you tell us what it was like? What was it? What was her voice like? How did she want her work presented?
Yeah, I mean, Betty is incredible, not only because she's such an amazing artist, but because, you know, she's in her 90s and she's been making this work for a long time. She knows what she wants, she knows how she wants it to be shown. And yeah, so for any of you who have worked with strong women in their 90s, like they want it the way they want it. And that's incredibly, it's really a gift to a curator to be able to work with an artist like that, to be able to make those things possible for them. So, I mean, what was amazing about the exhibition at MoMA, and we have beautiful installation shots online for anyone who wants to see them, was that it existed in this glowing purple space with very dim lighting. And that it was like being in Betty's head. Like she wanted that from the very beginning. She was very clear. And from a museum perspective, it worked well for us because works on paper get darker the more they're exposed to light. So we have very strict rules to kind of preserve the artwork about how low the light needs to be. And the fact that Betty wanted the room so kind of dark allowed us to make the light, in fact, really dim without affecting the way people saw the show. But you know, it was very much a little bit like she knew what she wanted, and we just had to kind of come up with several different options so she could be like, well, yeah, that's the one that you can do that is also what I want. And so, you know, it's always incredible to work with artists, period. But when someone has such a clarity of vision and such, yeah, I mean, they know best how to show their work. And so I just felt extraordinarily blessed to have the opportunity both to help her realize that, and then to watch her enjoy the exhibition happen and to share it with her incredible family.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and it was really striking to see the dark walls and her work just kind of jump out. So yeah, that was beautiful to see. Kazita had a question, and this is about, you were talking about artists and their visions and how clear they want it to be. His question was, or her question, sorry, do you think all of these three artists represent their time, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panthers, Afro-Cobra, or are their works timeless? Do they represent both the past and the present?
I mean, I think it's a really beautiful question. I don't feel like it's for me to answer. I mean, these are all works that, yeah, they come out of very specific contexts, and I think they represent very specifically those contexts. Like the symbol of Barbara the raised power fist that Jones-Hogu is showing there, the color she's using, is very much of its time, pulls from like Black Panther, Black Power imagery, definitely. Like I find that work very timeless in terms of what we're experiencing now, and in terms of my worldview, but I think other people might find it very specific to a given time. I think it just depends on your mindset. So, but it's a beautifully worded question, and I think the artists would all kind of really enjoy that way of thinking.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's really interesting that we're having this conversation. You chose three artists who are working from home, and it's so relevant to what's happening today. Especially we see comments on in the Coursera forums saying that they see the work, and especially with Black Girls Window, and now they're seeing more into it, especially as they spend more time at home as they see these windows. And on that, I'm just looking at, I was just conscious of time, and I realized we reached the hour already. So I just want to thank you, Esther, for all your insights, and thank you everyone for spending an hour with us and for your really exciting and thoughtful questions. You'll receive a short survey after this to help inform future office hours or study centers and other virtual course offerings. In the meantime, we'd love to keep the conversation going. So please continue sharing with us by posting in the discussion forums. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.